Hey everyone, today we'll be taking a look at my favorite camera of all time. It is the Fuji X100T. In my humble opinion, if you don't already own one of these things and you can afford it, you should go out and get one right now because it really is that good. Now, what makes the X100T so excellent? I think it comes down to a wide variety of factors. Perhaps the most important thing is something that we can't quantify using words. So usually when we evaluate a camera, we look at its sort of high ISO performance, we might look at sort of how well it does in low light, we might look at its focusing ability, its image quality, how many megapixel it might have, that might be important to some people, and its features. But I think with the X100T, the most important thing is the shooting experience this camera provides. This camera provides a very enjoyable and unique shooting experience that you might not get with something like a DSLR. So unlike a DSLR, which provides a very tactile yet mechanical shooting experience that you sort of just rinse and repeat again and again, this X100T provides a more unique and flavored shooting experience. It's styled in an old rangefinder design with the viewfinder on the top left hand corner rather than down the center, so it feels a lot easier to shoot with one eye. Well, you always shoot with one eye, but what I mean is it feels a lot easier when you're holding it up to your eye because it doesn't sort of block half of your face and squish your nose up against the LCD screen, as a lot of DSLRs do. When shooting vertically, however, it's also extremely comfortable in that you can hold it like that, and it's sort of unobtrusive and doesn't sort of push on your cheek, as a lot of DSLRs tend to do as well. So for such a small camera, it really packs a punch in the specifications department. It features an APS-C size sensor, which is the same as Nikon's DX cameras, allowing it to perform extremely well in low light, as well as being able to achieve a reasonably shallow depth of field if so desired. So rather than featuring a Bayer type sensor, which is what Nikon, Canon and other manufacturers use, Fuji uses a 16 megapixel X-trans type sensor. So that's a unique layout of red, green and blue elements, which allows it to minimize the effects of moire. So it allows it to remove the anti-aliasing filter, which is present on most Nikon and Canon cameras, in order to eliminate the effects of moire, which is sort of this banding effect you get on repetitive patterns. So by using the X-trans sensor, Fuji is able to achieve sharper images through the removal of the anti-aliasing filter, which is actually quite significant because even though it's a 16 megapixel sensor, it resolves a lot more fine detail than what you would expect from another 16 megapixel camera. In fact, when looking at this, the images from this guy, I feel like there's a lot more punch and there's actually a lot more micro contrast than when I'm shooting on something like my D750 or D600, which both have 24 megapixel full frame sensors. So that's one of the strengths of this camera. The sensor is genuinely unique and it's able to provide great image quality, and it's also coupled with an excellent lens. So this is a 23mm f2 lens, which is equivalent to around about a 35mm in full frame speed. So being an f2 lens, it's faster than most of your standard f2.8 zooms, and you have sort of a bit of an offsetting effect. So if you're used to shooting an f2.8 zoom on a full frame, this will provide the same sort of background blur and also the same low light performance as an f2.8 zoom on a full frame camera, because this is one stop faster at f2, but the DX or APS-C sized sensor is around about half the area of full frame. So balancing them out, you get very similar effects. Now, one of the most unique things about this camera, and one of the things that I like the most, is the hybrid optical EVF and OVF. So for people who don't know, OVF means optical viewfinder. So if you've shot with a DSLR, you're using an OVF. If you've shot with a rangefinder, you're using an OVF. EVF means electronic viewfinder, so that's what most mirrorless cameras use for their viewfinders. Now, EVFs and OVFs each have their distinct advantages and disadvantages, which I won't go through here because that's a topic for a very, very long video, and it's got a lot of sort of wide-ranging opinions on it. But this gives you the best of both worlds, in that you can use an EVF if you prefer, and you can also use an OVF. But keep in mind that the OVF on this camera isn't a DSLR OVF, but rather it's a rangefinder style OVF, which means that you're not actually looking through the lens as you are with DSLR. So when you look through the viewfinder on DSLR, what happens is that light from the lens is actually being reflected up through the mirror and the prism, and then that gives you the image. So you're actually looking through the lens. With this little guy, you're actually looking through this little window here. So it's a rangefinder style camera. So if you've used a Leica or a Contax, something like that, then you'll know exactly what this is. So in terms of being able to use the EVF/OVF, the EVF is what you would expect. So if you've used something like a Sony A7 or a Fuji X-T1, or any of those modern mirrorless cameras, you'll know exactly what an EVF is. But the OVF on this thing is unique. So a long time ago, DSLRs won the battle, quote unquote, with rangefinder cameras because they don't suffer from a very debilitating issue called parallax error. So with rangefinder cameras, you couldn't really get the exact framing of your shot, because when you're looking through this thing, you're not actually looking through the lens, so you're not seeing what the lens is seeing, and you get sort of a slightly different perspective, and you're not able to completely accurately frame your shot. But with this Fuji, because it's electronic, it's able to draw the frame lines onto the OVF, and the frame lines move depending on how close or how far you're focused to always give you a reasonably accurate field of view. So what do I prefer? Do I prefer the EVF or do I prefer the OVF? For me, I prefer the OVF because I do a lot of shooting in daylight, and with the OVF you obviously get a much more natural view, and your eyes don't have to adjust to the much darker EVF, which isn't quite as bright in daylight as the OVF is. So it's much more comfortable shooting experience in my opinion. There's also the option of having your image pop up in review through the OVF. So once you've shot the image can pop up in the EVF, and that shows up in the same place. So you don't have to always be consistently looking at your back screen, which I think is very convenient. But the more I shoot, the more I like to turn review off and just shoot with the OVF and sort of review the images when I get home rather than sort of review as I move along. But that's because I mostly use this camera as a street camera. If you're using this for something like weddings or for portraits, then I really recommend that you review your shots so you can get the shots you need if it's out of focus or if it isn't as you expected. Now, in terms of the performance of this camera, it's quick, but it's not DSLR quick. So if you're used to shooting a quick DSLR, something like a D750 that has almost instantaneous autofocus and performance, this will feel a little bit slower. So when I say slow, I don't mean that you have to wait for it, but the autofocus does, take a little second to lock on. And when it's writing to the card, it also tends to take a little while for it to get done. So you're not going to get that same snappy performance that you might be used to. But in terms of being able to shoot with it and shooting with it on a daily basis, I find that it's more than acceptable, and it's more than fast enough for anything you might want to use it for. Now, going back to the shooting experience of this camera, I believe that one of the best things that this camera offers is just how easily it handles and how well it's designed for shooting. Up the top here, you have a shutter speed dial, which allows you to set the shutter speed. I always leave the shutter speed dial in A, which stands for automatic, so the camera automatically selects the shutter speed. That allows me to adjust the aperture on the aperture ring in front of the lens. So that's basically shooting in aperture priority mode. It does away with the silly PASM modes and allows you to adjust everything directly, which is extremely convenient. Now, I like the fact that you can adjust the aperture on the lens because it's a very natural place where your left hand usually goes when you're shooting, and also it's nice to be able to sort of glance down and have an idea of what aperture you're shooting at without having to look at the LCD screen. Now, in terms of the image quality this camera provides, I've already mentioned before that it provides extremely excellent image quality due to the unique X-trans sensor. However, what I haven't mentioned is the fact that this camera sometimes does exhibit some hazing or some degradation image quality when shot at f2. So I usually like to shoot at f2.8 to eliminate those effects. I have a full gallery linked below with all of my images shot on this camera. I carry this camera with me every day, and I usually put around about 100 frames on it on any single day, of which around about 20 to 30 are actually usable and good shots. So check out the video description below where I have an album on Flickr of all of my sample shots with this camera. There's currently around 250 to 300 shots, and that's just going to expand over the near future. So that will give you an idea of what this camera is capable of and the images that you can produce with it. Now, in conclusion, what do I think about the X100T? I think the X100T is a very unique and expensive camera. It comes in at around $1,300 where I live in Australia, and to be laying out that much cash for this camera is quite a fair bit. So for the same price, you could look at getting something like a Micro Four Thirds system with a couple of lenses. You could look at getting something like the X-T10 with several Fuji lenses as well. For example, the 35mm f1.4 or the 27mm f2.8, both of which are great options for Fuji. And I think overall, if you're sort of a tinkerer who likes to use different lenses and who likes to shoot various things, then those options are much better. But this camera is unique in a way that the other cameras aren't. It offers an optical viewfinder, it offers a very good tactile and mechanical shooting experience, and it's just a joy to shoot with. It's small and light, it fits into a jacket pocket just fine, and it's a camera that you can take out without being seen as a photographer. So that's something that I genuinely enjoy using this camera. When you take it around, sure, it looks a little bit hipster, but when you take it around, people don't instantly see you and think that you're a photographer. People don't sort of step out of their way and walk around you rather than just sort of continuing on. So you don't get noticed as much. And I feel like that's one of the reasons why I'm able to get such better pictures from this compared with my DSLR, which tends to get a bit more attraction. So something when you're trying to capture candids, this allows you to really sort of get in a bit closer than you would be able to with DSLR before you get noticed. So overall, do I think you should buy this camera? Yes, yes, and yes. This is one of the best cameras ever made, period. It is really that good. And I think anyone who regularly shoots with a 35mm equivalent lens would benefit from having one of these, whether it's for travel, whether it's for family photos, whether it's for street shooting, or whether it's just for general shooting, so portraits, weddings, whatever it may be. Now, this camera is a lot less scary to look at than DSLR, so I think that's something that you should keep in mind as well, especially if you're intending to use this for weddings and portraits. So overall, I think this is an excellent camera. I highly recommend the Fuji X100T. It is my favorite camera of all time. It produces excellent image quality, and overall I think that it is a camera that is genuinely deserving of being in everyone's photography bag if you're a serious photographer. So thanks for tuning in today, guys. Yes, my review of the X100T might be a little bit biased. I know that there are downsides to it, such as the fact that it doesn't focus quite as fast as Fuji's X-T1, but overall I think it provides great image quality, great handling, and a very nice shooting experience in a small and light package that is not obtrusive, looks friendly, and is sure to put a smile on any photographer's face. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe to my channel for more videos, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.